This is my final quarterly sprint video for my project comparing components. So again, with sort of the fast nature of web development, there are very few consistent best practices for HTML and CSS, and um, and so people often sort of develop their own best practices and in isolation of a lot of other people. And so what websites provide are really valuable, authentic learning opportunities for learners to understand how common components are structured across websites. And so this project seeks to extract common practices and context-based insights in order to help learners interested in web development understand the design decisions, the trade-offs, and different approaches for writing front-end components, and basically support them making more informed code decisions when it comes to HTML. And so I will skip over the related work because I discussed this in my last quarterly sprint video in a lot more detail, and it hasn't changed all that much, except that building more on the value of learning from real world examples, simply because it allows people to, again, sort of work within authentic constraints, increases some personal motivation because it can be applied in more interesting ways, and conveys the relevance and significance of certain concepts in actual applications. And again, building on prior work of comparing content across web pages, how programmers and other learners learn, and the sorts of learning barriers that they encounter, um, and also ways of decomposing web pages in a structural manner. And so for this specific quarter, I was more focused on sort of reframing the project, not nearly as, just calculating or programmatically determining HTML or DOM comparison metrics, but more how to extract these sorts of insights from real people and real experts, because it provides additional nuance, subjectivity, personal preference, and really takes into account the sort of fast-paced nature of web development. And so, again, the aim of my project this quarter was really to incorporate a more crowdsourced aspects, because experts are such a valuable resource in the web development community and can draw meaning from code and comparisons in ways that programs and quantitative metrics just can't. Um, and and so in terms of design process, that was sort of the first sprint, was just reframing the design goal and more explicitly writing down design arguments, again, in the context of this reframed goal. And so I decided to call this system Contrast, for lack of a better name. But basically, the goal was to have this be a hub of surfacing common practices for HTML components across professional websites, and as a place to share strategies or preferences for front-end implementations of common front-end components. And so the hope is that by creating a social learning environment online, people can sort of additionally propose, discuss, and understand trade-offs and design decisions a little bit more in depth, in ways that sort of capture, again, like the nuance and subjectivity of web development. And so my design arguments pivoted a little from last quarter, but still incorporated the basic features of code simplification and annotation, component search, now more subjective code annotations, and really building out this public forum, sort of user-submitted comments and suggestions. And so the first sprint I did was mostly focused on sort of expert need finding, and understanding heuristics about how to actually determine what are good and bad choices in writing code or structuring code. And so I found that the way experts sort of approached this and how they processed examples was really sort of from the bottom up. They really wanted to learn the actual underlying structure as opposed to sort of copying and pasting and then whittling the code away. People's personal preferences and biases obviously strongly influenced how they approached and judged different practices or implementations. But overall, the three experts I interviewed were all very much concerned with code simplicity, readability, and understandability. And so those three sort of I guess, qualities were things that I really wanted to surface in the crowdsourced system. And so in the second sprint, I revised my design arguments to be more motivation related because I wanted to, again, reframe sort of the user-centered approach of this project. And that meant framing it in terms of what would ever motivate users to actually use the system. And so from the perspective of both learners and contributors, which are my two user classes, I came up with these 4 design arguments that it'll provide sort of an ease of use that inspecting or view sourcing professional websites with web tools already doesn't really provide, because we're providing code simplification and annotation of professional examples. And in terms of um, um, and in terms of the crowdsourcing aspect of it, reciprocity, reputation, credibility, ego, and altruism, and all these things that came from some prior work on communities like Stack Overflow, really helped to build a community of experts helping each other or experts helping learners. And so based on that, I brainstormed some data collection and data collection methods for a crowdsourcing platform that at a high level answers these sorts of questions for learners, and really to highlight, again, sort of the readability, understandability, and sort of simplicity of code. So how good does a component look visually? How good is the code? And then what are sort of interesting things in the code or the component itself to sort of highlight? And so measures of intuitiveness, how complex the HTML is and code length or depth. Is the complexity justifiable given how sort of the design needs and the design affordances of the component itself? Because we are talking about front-end components, obviously the visual aspect is very critical. How flexible or adaptable is the code for someone who wishes to incorporate in their own project? And then again, tying it back ultimately to sort of design needs and purpose is what is the component good for and in what context. And so based on these measures, I iterated several rounds of mock-ups that aim to sort of capture different types of data. The first was structured feedback in sort of categorization of certain examples and tagging of certain examples, and then freeform as well as structured sort of justifications for why these evaluations were the case. So for example, categorizing websites in terms of their purpose, a more Tinder-like swiping kind of interface that would help with sort of binary categorization or judgments and qualitative judgments, adding tags to describe aspects of the code, either holistically or in specific parts, and then freeform sort of justifications in the form of comments that would show up on the website. And finally, actually tying back certain tags that people have added to concrete lines of code in the actual example. And so I did, in the next sprint, conduct a user test and scenario with these sorts of iterated mock-ups and paper prototypes with both actual professional examples as well as 3 experts to get sort of information from experts as if this was the real thing. And then I used data from that to run a subsequent user test with 13 learners just in our DTR class using the crowdsourced expert data previously gathered, again, to sort of test the usefulness of real data collection and whether or not certain types of evaluations or justifications were actually interesting, and if not, then what were sorts of things that learners wanted to know that they didn't get from this tool already. And so in general, learners noted that in terms of technical insights, they were more curious about certain technologies and how they worked and how they sort of connected to the HTML. Syntax explanation was really useful for learners because a lot of the time certain attributes or tags or names, while the general structure might have been understood, specific parts, like certain tags, like an ARIA label would be sort of confusing for learners unless they had an explanation accompanying it. And in terms of conceptual insights, learners wanted to know more about the benefits of each type of implementation, so the necessary code for for certain types of functionality, why certain naming schemes, conventions, or patterns exist and how they connect to the CSS. And in terms of comparing two specific examples, learners really just wanted a more clear entry point or points of comparison into the code. And so, and wanting experts to sort of direct their attention to interesting things, because sometimes these samples can be obviously, hundreds of lines of code. And so these sorts of insights from this user study and this user test helped me finalize sort of the design for at least an initial platform, which I did build out, that has user flows for both expert contributors and learners. It's a Node app using Firebase as a backend and CodeMirror as a to display the actual code for websites. So Contrast is a site that compares common practices and approaches for writing front-end components across professional websites. As a contributor, you can add a component. For now, it's only navigation bars, and add, say, like Google, the URL, an image of that specific code example, and then and have users actually, inspect element and copy that code instead of doing that programmatically, which is slightly more difficult. And so as a contributor, you can then actually compare and analyze two different websites' navigation bars. The code is in here, and you can add tags. For example, YouTube's is messy, but Etsy's is clean. And again, sort of as the free-form justification, we can say it's clean because it's readable. Not a super helpful one, but we'll just do this for the sake of, for this demo, and maybe just say too many class names. And then finally, again, tying back the actual code, you can then highlight the code and to the tags they actually correspond to. And so clean, say Etsy this is a nice label that has descriptive classes. And so after that, as a learner, I can come in and compare two different websites, say Twitter, or we can actually go look at that exact example, Etsy and YouTube, and see all these expert contributions crowdsourced, and with the color-coded tags referring to like actual lines in the code that are relevant, and as well as there's my comment about why certain users added certain tags. And so that is the system that I ultimately tested in a pilot study. And so again, just to reiterate before we dive into that study design, the key sort of design arguments and affordances of this platform is leveraging professional code, because it gives learners a quick starting point and sort of prioritizes, the ease of discovery in terms of visual and structural similarities. Code simplicity, which was not quite an affordance of this specific platform, but simplicity in the sense of surfacing sort of tags that provide sort of like a qualitative analysis or at a glance analysis of how useful, how good, how bad the code is. The structural comparison of actually juxtaposing different websites not only identifies correlation between them, but helps them sort of understand design decisions and trade-offs better. Again, the expert contributions surface the subjective, qualitative information we can't really get otherwise, and also leverages domain-specific knowledge. And finally, the code annotations provide more very clearly defined entry points into professional examples for learners that otherwise wouldn't be obvious. And so the goals of my pilot study was to learn what extent the tool was helpful for learners in guiding code decisions and understanding different implementations of components, the actual types of insights that people found helpful, and types of insights that learners were sort of missing that weren't provided in the tool. And so sort of the research questions I wanted to answer in this was what concepts or approaches to writing a component's HTML are users able to recognize and learn? How do learners use the system to guide, again, their code decisions or gain understanding? And what types of insights do learners find helpful in various aspects of the system? And so I conducted an exploratory study with 6 college students who are learning web development but have basic knowledge of HTML and CSS. They were trained to use the system and given the task of building the HTML of a navigation bar from scratch just in Sublime Text or another text editor, with the requirements of a logo, 3 sections and tabs, and a drop-down menu. And they could use this platform, obviously, to help make those decisions. And sessions lasted for about 30 minutes, and participants were compensated $15 per study. And so and again, the actual system that was tested was sort of seeded with real data from experts in DTR about what were interesting points of comparison for learners that they thought. So the results really was that the system helped learners quickly identify different approaches to writing the HTML of a front-end component, in this case just a navigation bar, understand unfamiliar code, and make more informed decisions when structuring their code. And so people addressing the first research question, users were very quick to observe differences in the general HTML structure across a lot of examples, and they sort of noted the varying simplicity or complexity of different implementations, and the different use of tags and approaches also sort of informed how people actually structured their own code. For example, one user who generally shies away from the list structure noted that the Spotify example was just well annotated and organized, that it sort of made that approach a little less scary and more manageable. And again, they were really quick to observe common patterns across websites that they had never seen before, as well as made connections between specific websites' purposes and how that influenced those design needs, influenced HTML structure, complexity, and so forth. And additionally, it also helps challenge learners or prior notions about writing a front-end component, whether about what tags to use, how to structure it, what was considered like the default or the standard. And they kind of realized that, a lot of them realized that there actually is no sort of gold standard, but really, again, depends on specific design needs and affordances that specific websites require. And so addressing the second research question, learners really made use of pretty much all aspects of the interface, and really used expert contributed tags and comparisons to initially sort of choose what one or two examples to focus on, and sort of use the qualitative tags about which examples were clean versus messy, to know what to work off of, and then additional tags describing attributes like uses header instead of nav, or maybe say accessible because it uses certain classes or attributes, then helped again with the more specifics of actually structuring the code. And then finally, insights that learners found helpful in various aspects of the system. By far the most useful was sort of this color-coded annotation of the actual source code, followed by the ability to compare and just be able to visually see at a glance very quickly the similarities and differences across many examples. And then others found expert contributions and sort of the visual layout helpful in slightly less ways. And so next steps, which I unfortunately will not be here for, but hopefully someone who's interested in taking on this project after me, here are some things that I think would be necessary next steps. The first, again, would be sort of building metadata around a website component, connecting the HTML and CSS, because so far the project has, for 2 quarters, focused mainly on HTML, but the two are very intertwined. And then in terms of just this specific platform, iterating the information and content of that's actually displayed to users in code comparisons can be either structured or filtered in more interesting ways, and then making just a holistic system that combines previous quarter's work about programmatic metrics as well as this quarter's work of subjective expert contributions. And it should also just address sort of feedback from the pilot study about interface improvements and design affordances, more clearly connecting examples, visual outcome, and code, which is strongly important for a front-end component. And finally, just really connect sort of these user flows and really try and build an actual community or feedback loop to support the crowdsourced nature of the site and really of this work. And yeah, so that will be hopefully continued in subsequent quarters by other DTR members.